بەڕێز فەرهاد شاکەلی شاعیر و ئەکادیمی یەکێکە لە شاعیرانی پێشەنجی قۆناغی دوای گۆران مامۆستای زمانی کوردی بووە لە زانکۆی ئۆپسالە لە سوید نزیکەی 50 کتێب و لێکۆڵینەوەی بڵاو کردوتەوە بە زمانی کوردی و ئینگلیزی و سویدی جگە لە بوارەکانی شعر و ئەدەب و وەرجێڕاندا لە بواری مێژووی تەسەووفدا شارەزایەکی بەرچاوی هەیە چەندین لێکۆڵینەوەی لەم بوارەدا بڵاو کردوتەوە بابەتی ئەمڕۆی بە ناوی شێخ سیراجەدینی نەقشبەندی پێشکەش دەکات با بفەرمێت.
بابەتەکەم بە ئینگلیزی ڕاستیەکەی بۆ پەلەپەرش بۆم ناکرێتە کوردی. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and guests, you are welcome and Roshtan Wash. The main object of my paper is about the Sheikh Osman Sirajuddin I, but of course I am not standing beside him only, just I am going to continue or to talk about his sons and his those who followed him as sheikhs of as a family sheikh, as Sheikhli Sufi family. To talk about the Sirajuddin family, Sheikh family, is important from many aspects. One can read this heritage and this family. When we talk about Sufism, there are many analyses about it and its function in the society and for people. There are those who concentrate on or emphasize the social function of Sufism, and for others, including myself, the artistic, the aesthetic aspect of Sufism is very important. And those who are interested in politics emphasize the political aspect of Sufism. However, as I told you, I'm going to talk mainly about Sheikh Osman Sirajuddin I and those who followed him. And at the end of the paper, I am going to talk about two aspects which are important in the case of Sufism in Kurdistan, namely resistance, or whatever you call it, revolutionary line or other names. There are many names for that, but and the cultural heritage. The Sirajuddin Sheikhs. The Sirajuddin Sheikhs have been the most prominent representatives of the Khalidi suborder in Kurdistan since the time Mawlana Khalid left Kurdistan for Damascus at the end of 1237 Anno Hijra. 1822. Indeed, Sheikh Osman Sirajuddin I, who lived between 1781 and 1867, was the most important figure among Mawlana Khalid's disciples, even while Mawlana was still living in Kurdistan and or in Baghdad. The two men knew each other as students of Islamic science, faqih in Kurdish. And they met once again in Baghdad in 1811 during his return to during Mawlana's 5-month stay in the mosque of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gailani in Baghdad, shortly after his return from India to Sulaimani. It was then that Faqih Uthman, then he was called Faqih Uthman, of course, who afterwards was known to as Sirajuddin I, was initiated to the path of Mawlana Khalid. That's to say, to Naqshbandi. After 2 years of spiritual training, he was the first person to become a full-fledged Khalifa deputy of Mawlana. He was then 33 years old. Sheikh Uthman Sirajuddin was born in Tawela, in the region of Hawraman, near Halabja. According to many sources, his parents were descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, The family thus is a Sayyid family, as people say, of course. But the Sirajuddini themselves, but the Sirajuddin Sheikhs never claimed being Sayyids. Sheikh Uthman signed his letters with his own name, followed by Al-Khalidi, Al-Mujaddidi, Al-Naqshbandi. Sheikh Uthman accompanied his preceptor during the years in which Mawlana was twice obliged to leave Sulaimani for Baghdad. In Sulaimani, Sheikh Uthman usually substituted for Mawlana in Khatam assemblies. The disciples were instructed by Mawlana to attend Uthman's Khatam circles. Among these were outstanding names like Sayyid Ismail Dagestani, Mullah Abdul Hakim Kashghari, and Sheikh Muhammad of Halabja. Apparently, Mawlana Khalid, who had apparently, Mawlana Khalid, who had much organizational ability, was preparing his disciple to succeed him and to take the difficult and crucial responsibility of spreading the Sheikh Uthman, the order in Kurdistan. When Mawlana left Sulaimani for Baghdad for the last time in 1820, Sheikh Uthman did not follow him. He moved instead to his home region, that's to say to Hawraman, and began to establish a strong base for the order, which became one of the most important centers for the Khalidi sub-order in the whole Middle East, continuing to be such until the 1950s. The center not only contributed greatly in spreading the Sufi teachings of the Naqshbandi order, but also produced a number of poets whose poems are the most marvelous and significant examples of Sufi poetry. The indispensable position of Sirajuddin and for Mawlana and for the order becomes more clear when we know that during the summer months of 1821 and 1822, Mawlana left the heat of Baghdad for the summer resorts of Hawraman, where he met Sirajuddin and supervised the Naqshbandi networks in Kurdistan. Sheikh Uthman, who visited Mawlana in Baghdad at least once during this period, it was from Kurdistan, not from Baghdad, as it is commonly but wrongly accepted that the sources about the Khalidi order that Mawlana Khalid went to Damascus. Most of the researchers say that Mawlana went from Baghdad to Damascus. It's not true, of course. He was in Khurmal, and he went to nearly Mosul, I think, until Turkey, and then to Urfa, and probably the Kurdish region in Syria, and Deir ez-Zor, and so on to Damascus. So what the information that he moved to Damascus from Baghdad is not true. A few years later, 1838, the Baban Ahmed Pasha visited Sheikh Uthman to be in charge of the Khalidi Khanaqah in Sulaimani. The Sheikh accepted the task and supervised the Khanaqah, but he did not abandon Hawraman, returning then often. With the exception of those 2 years, Sheikh Uthman lived in Tawila and Biara in Hawraman from 1820 to the year Mawlana left Sulaimani for Baghdad until his death, 1867, the death of Sheikh Uthman, I mean. In nearly half a century, he had become the most prominent Khalifa of Mawlana Khalid in Hawraman and Baban region. The Sheikh had a great number of Khalifas and Mansoubs, deputies and affiliates from different regions in Kurdistan and the Middle East. In his hagiography about Mawlana Khalid and the Naqshbandi Sheikhs of Auraman, Mala Abdul Karimi Mudarris enumerates 96 Khalifas and 23 Mansoubs of Sheikh Uthman. Among them, we find many great ulama and poets in addition to two powerful rulers, Ahmed Pasha of Baban and Razaquli Khan of Sanandaj in Ardalan. This is contrary to what many researchers suggest, that the Naqshbandiya was only an assembly for opposition sects in the Kurdish society. In addition to his letters, there are a few lines of poetry and 10 advisory articles by Sheikh Uthman, in which he instructs his disciples in the ways of the order. In one of these articles, dated 1856, he appoints his sons, Muhammad Bahauddin and Abdul Rahman, as his deputies and successors, and advises his followers to obey them. Sheikh Uthman Sirajuddin I was succeeded in turn by 5 sheikhs in his family. However, it should be indicated that other members of the family have been in charge of the path in different periods, each with his own disciples and khanaqas. Sheikh Uthman Sirajuddin I was succeeded directly by his son, Sheikh Muhammad Bahauddin, who lived between 1837 and 1881, although in his testament, Sirajuddin had appointed 2 of his sons, Bahauddin and Abdurrahman Abul Wafa, who lived 1837 to 1868, to be his successors, except for a very short time. Sheikh Abdurrahman declined this position and resided in Baghdad. He was a creating poet. The small number of poems to which we have access today, some 70 poems in Persian, mostly ghazals, indicates that his talents as a Sufi poet. Bahauddin was also a poet, although only a few of his poems are extant. The third sheikh in the Sirajuddin Silsila, initiating chain, was Sheikh Umar Diyauddin, 1839 to 1901. He was distinguished from his predecessors in some aspects. It was during his time as a sheikh that dhikri jahr, that's to say vocal remembrance, was practiced in addition to dhikri khafi, the silent remembrance. It was known for his enthusiasm for science and education, and for culture and as a whole. He built several new khanaqas in Kifri, Khazrabat, Biara, Tawela, and Sardasht. He was a brilliant poet in Kurdish, Persian, and Arabic. In his poems, he used Fawzi as his takhallus, that's his pen name. We have access to some of some 50 letters written by him to his deputies or the great men of his time, among whom we find the Qajari Shah Muzaffar ad-Din, who reigned from 1896 to 1907, and the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II reigned 1876 to 1909. There are, moreover, 3 treatises on Sufi teachings. A remarkable feature in the left is the life of Sheikh Umar Diyauddin was the good relation he had with the Qadri sheikhs and their disciples and followers, which will be dealt later. I don't think I have time to do that. The immediate successor in the chain was his son, Sheikh Najmuddin, 1863-1918, who was known for his zuhd, renunciation. The Ottomans wanted to give him a monthly salary to use for the Khanaqah and its visitors, but the Sheikh rejected the offer. He had great interest in intellectual conversations with the scholars who so often visited the Khanaqah in Biara. He was a poet, but the number of the poems available to us is very small. Sheikh Najmuddin was succeeded by his brother Sheikh Muhammad Alauddin, 1863 to 1954. He wrote a treatise in Arabic entitled Tibb al-Qulub, Healing the Hearts, which contains advice and recommendations. He was a well-known physician who helped thousands of people in the region, and he prescribed herbal medicine to them. When Sheikh Alauddin died in 1954, he was succeeded by his son, Sheikh Muhammad Uthman Sirajuddin II. I think many of us have met this Sheikh, who died in 1997. Who was already a well-known and established Sufi leader. Sheikh Uthman II was deeply learned in Islamic theology as well as in Kurdish and Persian poetry. He was moreover a skillful physician with wide knowledge of herbal medicine. When the monarchy in Iraq was overthrown by General Abdul Karim Qasim, Sheikh Uthman left Iraqi Kurdistan in 1959 and resided in Iranian Kurdistan for about 2 decades. After the Iranian Revolution, he came back to Hawraman, Iraqi Kurdistan, but he soon left it for Baghdad. He spent the last 7 or 8 years of his life in Istanbul, where he died on 30 January 1997. He was buried inside his residence close to the Khanaqah in Istanbul. Sheikh Uthman was also a poet. 2 volumes of his poems in Kurdish and Persian are published, as well as a volume of his treatises and letters entitled Siraj al-Qulub, Lantern of Hearts, of which an English translation is also available, but it is not a good translation, of course. The role of the Naqshbandi Sheikhs of Hawraman in spreading and establishing the Naqshbandiya, Mujaddidiya, Khalidiya in Kurdistan and in parts of the Middle East is of central importance. It was under their guidance, as well as that of their deputies, that the order reached most of the regions in Iraqi and Iranian Kurdistan, Turkmen Sahara in Iran, northern Syria, Lebanon, and Bosnia. Nevertheless, they still identified themselves as Khalidi and Mujaddidi, and never, I mean the family of Sirajuddin, and never invented or claimed to have invented a new suborder. The post-Mawlana Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Khalidi in Kurdistan, I think I am leaving this one. An important question, which is when we talk about culture, literature, and thought, I think is the theory of Wahdat al-Wujud. I usually use WW, which is not a Kurd shortening. Wahdat al-Wujud, that's to say, did they believe in this theory or not? Wahdat al-Wujud, we know that it was established theoretically mainly by Ibn Arabi, but it was before Ibn Arabi even. There were thoughts which one can describe as parts of Wahdat al-Wujud. I think Professor Algar is right when he talks about that this philosophy was only under short time. That's to say when Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi became the leader or the Mujaddid of the Al-Alf al-Thani, the 10th millennium. So he was not with وحدة الوجود. But this forbidden, that's to say his attitude against وحدة الوجود, did not continue to a long time. Probably only his sons and the third generation. But when we come to Sheikh Ubaidullah Dehlawi, according to Professor Algar, he was not against وحدة الوجود at all. And then even Mawlana Khalid, there are many significant details that Mawlana Khalid was not against. What is said about Mawlana Khalid's attitude against وحدة الوجود is said by other people, not by Mawlana himself. One of them is Azawi and the other one is Alusi, two Arab Sufis who claim that Mawlana Khalid was against it and forbid people to read the books which had to with this theory to do. That's not true, according to my understanding to the case. The genuine and friendly relation between the Qadris and Naqshbandi was not limited to the leaders of the two orders. The Kurdish Sufi poet Mawlawi was a deputy of Sheikh Osman Sirajuddin I and his son Sheikh Muhammad Bahauddin, but at the same time he was a good friend of Sheikh Abdul Rahman Talabani and Sheikh Kak Ahmad. Both great leaders of the Qadri order visited them and sent letters to them. He wrote poems in praising Sheikh Abdul Rahman and wrote 2 elegies when the Sheikh died. His friendship with the family continued even after the death of the Sheikh. Mawlawi visited Sheikh Ali Talabani, and on one association he stayed several months in the Qadri Takia in Kirkuk. There are many other examples which I... one of the main points which I have to talk about is the cultural heritage, which is important for when it comes to talk about this family. The cultural heritage, in addition to hundreds of letters and a great number of treatises, Mawlana Khalid also wrote tens of poems in Kurdish, Arabic, and Persian. These were collected and printed in Istanbul in 1844. Only 18 years after his death. Even in his letters, Mawlana Khalid usually quoted lines of poetry. Often these are lines by known poets such as Hafiz, Mawlana Jalaluddin Rumi, Shahi Naqshband, Shabastari, Jami, Bidli, Bukharai, and others. But in many of his letters, he enriches them with lines of poetry of his own. The addition of these lines of poetry shows clearly Mawlana's sophisticated taste and appreciation of poetry, as well as the impact of words as a whole. The tradition was developed further by the Naqshbandi Sheikhs of Hawraman, the Sirajuddin Sheikhli family. In the 1830s, Sheikh Uthman's region to an important center of Sufism and culture, which attracted a great number of the poets and scholars. Other sheikhs in the family who succeeded him during the last 1.5 century continued to promote Kurdish culture. Among their disciples, there have always been great scholars and poets who not only contributed to the spreading of the order, but also created great works that continue the grounds of Kurdish Sufi, that constitute the grounds of Kurdish Sufi literature, which is an important feature of the Kurdish culture as a whole. Mala Hamidi Katib, I shall not talk about the dates because of the time, was initiated to the path by Sheikh Uthman Sirajuddin in 1834 and remained with the family until his death. He served as Katib to the Sheikh and his sons Muhammad Bahauddin and Umar Diyauddin. Mala Hamid, who was known also as Mala Hamid Besarani, was a writer and poet, but his poems are mainly devoted to record social events, including the births and the deaths of the prominent members of the Sirajuddin family or the order in the general. His another two great important Kurdish Sufi poets are Sayyid Abdul Rahim Mawlawi, also known as Ma'dumi, and Sheikh Muhammad Mahwi, who undoubtedly merit being studied thoroughly as example of excellent and significant Sufi literature. Other important poets and scholars affiliated to the Naqshbandi Sheikhs of Hawraman are Haji Sayyid Hassan, Mala Abdullah Delajei Koyi, Sheikh Salimi Takhtai, also known as Salimi Sina, Sheikh Muhammad Amin Hawleri, Sheikh Umar ibn al-Qaradaghi, Sheikh Baba Rasul Baban, and many others which I noted. Thank you very much.
زۆر سپاس. سپاس بۆ کاک فەرهاد کە جگە لە کرۆنۆلۆژی مێژووی بنەماڵەی شێخانی تەوێڵە و هەروەها کوڕونەوەکانی و نووسین و کتەبەکانی دووسێ بابەتی نوێی وروژاند. یەکێک لەوانە چوونی مەولانا خالید بۆ دیمەشق وەک کاک فەرهاد دەڵێ لە بەغداوە نەبووە بەڵکو لە سلەیمانی بووە لە خورماڵ بڵێ و هەروەها سەرهەڵدانی مجەددیی خالیدی لە کوردستان تەنها بۆەوە نەبووە کە دژی لایەنێک بێت و جگە لەوە مەسەلەی وحدەت الوجودیش. زۆر سپاسێکی.